One of the things that we all have in common is stories about our parents. And with it being Mother's Day today, I thought it might be fun to share some funny stories that I found online that people had about their moms. One lady had a story where she said, "My mother had just finished taking a CPR class at a local college when she and I were at the mall and saw a big crowd gathered around a still body. Mom took off running at a speed I didn't know she could muster, yelling, 'Everybody back, I know CPR.' And just as she threw herself next to the body and was about to begin, a pair of strong hands pulled her to her feet. 'Ma'am,' said a police officer beside her, 'we are trying to arrest this man.'" Another lady, Emily, her and her mother bumped into an old family acquaintance on the street. "Is this your daughter?" the woman asked. "I remember when she was this high. How old is she now?" And without pausing, Emily's mom said 24. Emily, 35, nearly fainted on the spot. When the woman left, Emily asked her mom why she told such a whopper. Emily, her mother, replied, "I have been lying about my age for so long, it suddenly dawned on me that I'd have to start lying about yours too." Another one is about somebody's cousin. "My cousin wanted to introduce his bride-to-be to his hypocritical mother. Hypercritical mother, excuse me. But in order to get an unbiased opinion, he invited over 3 other female friends as well and didn't tell his mom which one he intended to marry. After the 4 women left, he asked his mother, 'Can you guess which one I want to marry?' She said, 'The one with short hair.' He went, 'Yes, how'd you know?' And she said, 'Because that's the one I didn't like.'" Now, I thought it'd be fair just to also share a story of my own life with my mom. And this one involves my brother, Josh. I've shared this one to a youth group before. But one time growing up, we were homeschooled, and we did a lot of our chores in the morning as well some days. During the school week, as part of our schooling, we always did it that way because it was like, sweet, not doing math today. I'll dust or vacuum. That would be better in that school mentality. So we did that, and my mom would write a list for us and leave it in the kitchen, and we would just check off our chores as we did it. And she gave us these chores and said, "Okay, you need to get these done by lunch." Well, and I was usually a lot faster than my brother, and he hated doing some of the things, and so there's things I hated, and we would switch sometimes, and this was one of those days I was like, do your list, don't just go back and forth. But she didn't say I couldn't take on some extra chores that my brother had, because we also had learned, like, if we wanted some extra video game time, we might say, "Hey, I'll do this if I get the Xbox for a few extra minutes today." And so I made that deal with my brother. I think it was like dusting or something. Dusting and like vacuuming. I would breeze through that real quick. He hated it, and it would take forever. And so he's like, "Fine, I'll do that. I don't want to do those anything. I hate it." So I took those from his list. He finished his 3 or 4 things. I finished my 4 or 5 things and was going to do those after lunch. But we didn't tell my mom this, which is where the problem started, because at lunch we're eating and my mom just sees Josh's list without those 2 things checkmarked. And my list looks done. He is done, but it doesn't look like he's done. And she said, "Get done by lunch." So she starts talking to him at lunch. "Josh, did you finish your list?" "Yes, I did." "Well, not everything's checked off." "Well, my list is done. I'm not doing those." Which, again, there's probably a better way. He probably could have started this whole thing out, but it just looked like he was being defiant to my mom. And so I'm at the table with them, and I'm off to the side just kind of smiling to myself, keeping my head down, laughing, because my brother's getting in trouble for no reason, and I know it, which was great for being the younger sibling. So proceeded to have this conversation for about 5-10 minutes of going back and forth, raised voices, and I'm just starting to laugh at this point because I could speak up and tell the truth, but I didn't because I was the younger brother. And eventually my brother finally just goes, "Mom, it's not my job. Caleb's doing those." And my mom just stops, thinks about it for a second, and looks at me and just goes, "Is that true?" And I kind of, "Yeah." It's like, "Okay, get them done after lunch." And my brother was just like, "What are you talking about? You just yelled at me." Or not yelled at me, she didn't yell. But she got after me for about 5 minutes here, and you're not even going to get after him for not doing it. So he was a little bit not pleased with me at the time. But we all have these stories about our mothers in various ways. There's times where we laughed with them. There's times where we cried. There's times when we saw how proud of us they were. And there's times when they were very disappointed. And we could also tell stories about the life lessons that we've learned from them. Today, though, I want us to look at some of the stories of different mothers that we can read about in Scripture. Now, there are a lot of mothers mentioned in the Bible, and so it's definitely difficult to talk about all of them, but I want to talk about some of the mothers that, as I've read and studied Scripture throughout the years, these are some of the mothers that have stood out to me. The first mother I want to talk about today is Jochebed. She is the mother of Moses. Now, when we read about her in Exodus chapter 2, it says, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river. And his sisters stood at a distance to know what would be done. Now the daughter of the Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young woman walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.' Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?' The Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages.' So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because, she said, 'I drew him out of the water.'" Now, the reason that she hid Moses at this time was, again, Pharaoh was seeing how numerous the Israelite people were becoming and was feeling threatened by them, so he ordered that all of the infant boys be executed. And so that's why Moses' mother hid him when she had it, and then eventually got to the point, "I can't do it anymore," and put him in the reeds. And of course, Pharaoh's daughter found Moses, and one of the things that happened was Moses' older sister saw this happen and said, "I'll go get you somebody, one of the Hebrew women, to nurse him." And so she went and obviously got Jochebed. And Jochebed was able to still be part of Moses' life to an extent, but again had to give him up to Pharaoh's daughter in the end as well. And he became Pharaoh's son, excuse me. Another mom we can read about in Scripture is Rebekah. She was the mother of Jacob and Esau. And when we read about her in Genesis chapter 25, verses 19 through 27, it says, "These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban and the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, 'If it is thus, why is this happening to me?' So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 'Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger.' When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak, so they called his name Esau. Afterwards, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents." Now, one of the things, too, with Rebekah that we need to know is afterwards, when they were both fully grown and both men, when Isaac was about to give Esau his blessing and basically the inheritance that he was promised as being the older son, Rebekah helped maneuver Jacob into the point where Jacob would receive the blessing instead of Esau. And so that was one of the things that she did to make sure that this promise that God had said would come true. Another mother we read about is Hannah. She was the mother of Samuel the prophet. When we read about her in 1 Samuel, she's in chapters 1 and 2. But a little backstory, because it's a little bit of a longer passage, so I'm going to give you a little synopsis here real quick. She was the wife of Elkanah, and she was one of two wives. And each year they would go and worship and make sacrifices at Shiloh, where Eli, the prophet, was with his sons. And Elkanah, it would talk about that he would give portions to his one wife, and she had children. But he gave double portions to Hannah because she had no children. And this was one of the things that Elkanah's other wife would use against Hannah to try to torment her and just make her feel miserable. And on one of those occasions, when they were there at Shiloh and they were doing the sacrifice, doing the worship, they were feasting. And one time she goes, and in verse 9 in chapter 1, we read, "After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. And now Eli, the priest, was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, 'O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head.' As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, 'How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you.' But Hannah answered, 'No, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation.' Then Eli answered, 'Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him.' And she said, 'Let your servant find favor in your eyes.' Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. They rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, 'I have asked for him from the Lord.'" Another mom we read about in Scripture is, her name is Naomi, and she was the mother-in-law to Ruth. If you've ever read the book of Ruth, it's a really good book. If you haven't, I recommend it. We're not going to read all of that today because that would be a lot of time, and you could probably do a whole sermon just based on that book. So we're just going to look at Naomi in a little bit short. But I want to give you an intro to who she is. So in Ruth, you can read, "In the days when the judges ruled there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went to the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband." Now this is just, like I said, the beginning of Naomi's story, and so it starts off with her husband, her sons. They move to this country, and they move there, and her husband dies, and then 10 years later, after her sons had been married, they die. And she, at this point, feels like she feels like she's cursed from God, and that she's going to, at this point, she tells her daughter-in-laws, "Go home to your families, because I'm going to go home to Bethlehem. God has left me. You don't need to be part of this. I'm not going to make you suffer. I'm not going to have any more kids to give to you to be husbands in the future, so just go home and try to do something different." Orpah goes home, but Naomi stays. And as they go home, they go home to Bethlehem, Ruth with Naomi, and as they do that, Naomi helps Ruth meet in a situation Boaz, who becomes the kinsman redeemer. That's something you can read about in the book of Ruth. But Naomi helps position Ruth as well to be able to marry Boaz as well. The last mom we're going to look at today her name is Elizabeth. Now, the start of Elizabeth's story is with her husband, Zechariah. He was a priest, and while he was at the temple one day, Gabriel appeared to him and told him that they would have a son and that they should name him John. However, Zechariah didn't quite believe Gabriel because they were older, and so he's like, that's not going to happen. And so Gabriel made it so that Zechariah was mute and would remain so until John was born. And here's what happens at the end of her pregnancy. Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. And after her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her, on the 8th day they came to circumcise the child. And they would have called him Zechariah after his father, but his mother answered, "No, he shall be called John." And they said to her, "None of your relatives is called by this name." And they made signs to his father, inquiring what he wanted him to be called. And he asked for a writing tablet and wrote, "His name is John." And they all wondered. And immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue loosed, and he spoke, blessing God. And fear came on all their neighbors, and all these things were talked about through all the hill country of Judea. And all who heard them laid them up in their hearts, saying, "What then will this child be?" For the hand of the Lord was with him. Now again, these are just 5 examples of some of the mothers that we can read about in Scripture. And through their stories of their lives, and the other mothers in Scriptures as well, there are a lot of things that we can learn from them. But there's 5 characteristics that I want us to look at today that we can learn from these mothers. The first characteristic that I think we can learn from them is sacrifice. Now, all these mothers sacrificed what they would want or to do, what was best for their children. Mothers sacrifice themselves all the time. Sometimes it's even sacrificing their lives in childbirth to have their children, to give their child life. They sacrifice always. Jochebed was willing to sacrifice a life of being with Moses in order to save it. She was willing to let someone else claim him as their own in order for him to actually have a life. Because she hadn't done this, otherwise he would have died potentially like all the other newborn sons that were being born in Israel at that time. Hannah was willing to sacrifice as well her life with her son Samuel and give him up to the Lord in order to have a child. Now, it talks about in Scripture that God did bless her later with more children, but she had to give up Samuel, and Samuel went and lived in the temple with Eli and was raised there away from his family in order to have a life devoted solely to God. And yes, she did see him when they came and did worship, but she was not necessarily the mother for Samuel that way. Another characteristic that all these mothers have is faith. They had faith in God that he would protect, help, and provide for themselves and for their children through these entire situations. Jochebed had faith that God would keep Moses safe among the reeds and take care of him and get him to a place of safety. Hannah had faith that God would help her to become pregnant even after years of being unable to. Naomi had faith that God would help them out of the situation they were in when they finally went back, and she saw hope in the idea that Boaz could be this kinsman redeemer to them. Rebekah had faith that God would fulfill his promise of her children. The idea of the one being the older serving the younger, she had faith that that would happen. Elizabeth had faith that God would help her to have a child as well because she was also barren. And she had the faith even when her husband did not. The next characteristic is wisdom. They had the wisdom to see God could work through their faith. Again, Jochebed had the wisdom to hide Moses at first and then put him among the reeds when she did at a certain time. She had the wisdom and the knowledge and the understanding that you can't just put the infant baby in right out of a week old. She had to take time. Naomi had the knowledge to help Ruth and had the wisdom and the understanding to help navigate her into the place where she would be able to be in a relationship and in a marriage with Boaz. Hannah had the wisdom to seek God and to not just necessarily be taken as a drunken woman. She had the wisdom and the words to explain her situation to Eli in that situation. Rebekah had the wisdom that God had told her what would come to pass would happen no matter what, and she even used her own skills and strength and her knowledge to help Jacob get to that point as well. The next one is strength. They had the strength to continue to love and trust God and the strength to do what was needed no matter what the situation. Naomi had the strength to continue on to love her daughter-in-law like her own, even after her husbands and children had died, and she was struggling with the grief and struggling with the idea that she just felt like God had abandoned her and had cursed her. Elizabeth had the strength to go through her entire pregnancy with a husband who could not speak at all. Now, I don't know about any of the couples here, but I feel like Katie probably would have killed me if I would have stayed quiet the entire time she was pregnant with Ben and Jeff. The other, Jochebed, she had the strength to let Moses go and to sacrifice, and the sacrifice and strength that she had in this story, they go together. Along with Hannah, she had the strength to promise to give her unborn child up to God, and it showed the incredible strength she had. It also showed her ability to put up with her husband's other wife, with the torment that she was giving about not having a child. It showed her strength of putting up with that and her faith and her strength of being able to go through with it and trusting in God. The last characteristic that these mothers show us is their loving nature. Now, every one of these mothers loved their children so much that they made sure to do what was best for their family. Now, these aren't the only things we can learn from these mothers, and if we went through and dissected everything we could, we'd be here a really long time. But one thing that we can see is that these things are still being taught to this day. Obviously, every mother is different, and every mother teaches a different way. But these characteristics are still being taught today. Mothers continue to be amazing and teach their children the important things. That when we follow God, we will need to sacrifice the things we want to do for our own lives. We must be dedicated to God's will for our lives and understand that we have a part to play in building his kingdom here on earth. We need to use the wisdom that we have been given and not be stubborn to the point where we think we have all the answers. We need to have faith in God that even when we can't see it, he's there to help us and to give us strength that we need in order to overcome some of the difficult times in our life. We need love. We need to love not only those who it's easy to love, we need to love those who it's difficult to love. Now, I've learned with having two boys of my own for 7 years now, still pretty young and still learning, but there are times where they push my buttons and make me kind of feel to the limit. It's like, why do I love you? We used to watch a show where the husband in the show would tell his wife, legally, I have to love you. Sometimes it can almost feel like you get to that point, but at the same time, thankfully, though, moms have a special love, and it's a source of comfort for her children. Because even though you kids might drive a mom crazy, she still loves them. And this love from a mother gives us one of those special perspectives that we can see on how God is towards us in our own lives. Now, a lot of times growing up, kids are a little bit sometimes more afraid to go to their dad because they get a little bit more discipline from their dad sometimes. And that's the scary. I remember growing up when something happened and it was bad, I didn't necessarily go straight to dad. I'd go to mom first. She kind of helped soften the blow sometimes. Not that my dad was just angry or doing things to me, but it's that idea, a little bit of the fear and respect of dad compared to mom. She is more of the comforter. And even God describes himself in Isaiah chapter 66 of being a source of comfort like a mother comforts her son. And that's that special, unique perspective that we can see, that we get from a mother. We understand God being able to comfort us because of a mother's love for us as well. And as we leave here today, I hope that we not only thank and appreciate our mothers and the mothers who've also had an impact on our lives, but let us make sure to take the biblical truths and make sure that we are not only living them out, but we make sure that we continue to pass them on to our future generations as well.